Well, good morning or good evening from my side of the globe. I'm happy to welcome Professor Matovski. Thank you for being here. ICEUR is continuing its series of interviews with international experts on Russia and Ukraine. And you are an assistant professor at the Department of National Security Affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey and an associate at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. So Russia started the war against Ukraine, well, around a month ago, and the situation is still dynamic and it's hard to get valid information. So there are many indicators that things are not going according to Russian plans. So Russia has announced to focus its military campaign on the eastern part of Ukraine. What is the background of this new strategy and its public announcement?
Thank you very much for the invitation and then for this opportunity to weigh in on these issues. Before I start, I just want to say my usual disclaimer that I present my own research and views rather than the views of the U.S. Navy, Department of Defense, and U.S. government. And you're absolutely right. So like they're trying to pivot the war towards some more realistic objectives from what they originally started with. They started with the original very highly flawed plan, in which the Russian war effort was spread thin along multiple divergent and contradictory lines of attack. So now there are indications they're scaling down the efforts in some of these directions and focusing on conquering the strategic land bridge to Crimea, as well as consolidating control of the Donbass region. And then kind of in the Russian rhetoric, in like propaganda, you see the spin is basically that this was the goal all along. So they kind of dialed down what they originally said would be this denazification, quote unquote, and like removing the leadership of the country and like really scaling down the objective. So this, if they focus on this would amount to conquering the so-called Novorossiya territory, which was a term invented or thrown into the public realm after the annexation of Crimea. And this is a much more manageable war objective or an invasion than what Russia attempted originally. The purpose, it seems right now, would be to encircle and destroy the Russian forces in the Donbass region. I'm sorry, not the Russian, the Ukrainian. Mind you, Ukrainians have been stretched very thin as well to defend along these axes. So they're trying the more minimal objective in this sense. But the problem is really changing objectives in the middle of the campaign is very difficult to do, even under the best circumstances and under the best kind of resourced and prepared armies. First of all, Russian forces are not positioned well to execute new efforts. They're exhausted by fatigue and attrition. They lost any advantages of a first strike and surprise as well. And most importantly, Russians cannot just pull back from other efforts so easily. Their kind of logistics are stretched, their forces are exposed. And if they pull out, say, from besieging Kiev and then even threatening Kiev, that will free up Ukrainian forces as well that could move to the other theater or like the other side of the attack. So I'm not sure they want to do that. So we're still kind of all over the place, basically, in this. So the Russians are trying to kind of fix the situation on the run, on the go, but I'm not sure they'll be able to do that. And mind you, they're not giving up a lot of the territory they've gained in other areas or those efforts. So they're exposed because they're stretched thin. So just to defend what they got in other realms beyond Eastern Ukraine, they have to still kind of wage warfare there, stage attacks, and so on. So fighting is really still going on across the entire battlefield in many ways, especially as Putin is kind of vulnerable domestically and presiding over this fiasco. We'll have to see how they'll manage this.
Thank you for your assessment. Well, many Western analysts have claimed that the invasion has been so far disastrous for the Russian army. So would you agree with this statement?
Absolutely, it was disastrous across the board. First, starting with the kind of the highest strategic level, the political aims were bordering on delusional. They wasted campaign resources along so many different multiple axes of advance and contradictory ones, like going in different directions. And just to kind of give you the scale with some numbers of how ill-conceived this was, you had about 150 roughly Russian soldiers that entered Ukraine, and this is a population of 44 million. So this is a force ratio of about 3.5 soldiers per 1,000 people. Even if you assume you control half the Ukraine, with these war aims, and they wanted more originally, this is far below the force ratios of successful occupation. So I don't know, for instance, the Allied forces occupying Germany after 45 had about 90 troops per 1,000 inhabitants. Even when you look at Russia's invasion of Chechnya in 99, they started that with about 100 per 1,000 inhabitants. The US invasion of Iraq in 2003 had about 12 troops per 1,000 population at the beginning of the campaign. And Russians had just 3.5. So they are kind of completely beyond the scale of the achievable here. And it's going to be interesting someday when we learn how they managed to corner themselves with this, to see what the background of that ambition was, basically. So the scale and ambition of the campaign, the other disaster, exposed the dysfunction of the Russian military on all levels. Despite the reforms that they were, supposedly carried out, this is still very much the dysfunctional army that fought the Afghanistan war in the 80s, then the Chechen wars in the 90s. With the casualty figures to show, they've managed to achieve in a month what, or actually lose in a month what they lost over a decade in Afghanistan, for instance. It also exposed the corruption of the Putin regime, and this is kind of the core fight, if you like, we're kind of looking at now. It's really in how it's eating out Russia's might in the military realm. So Russian soldiers were deployed with rations decades past their expiry dates, with dysfunctional radios, with up to 60% of precision munitions misfiring, and a lot of other pathologies. So, rather than project strength, the campaign fully exposed as well the fundamental weakness of Russia. It's kind of exposed this, what a lot of analysts call Potemkin army. Something that challengers to Russia, both internal and external challenges to the Russian regime as well, have noted on and acted on. Actually, Azerbaijan was deploying forces in Nagorno-Karabakh in response to Russian kind of buffer force in the region withdrawing to be redeployed to Ukraine. So the kind of one of the key outcomes potentially is this internal instability that's created by revealing this degree of weakness. So this is a severe challenge to the Putin regime, which core appeal was that he helped pull Russia from the collapse of the 90s. And the performance is back to the 90s of the Russian military. They're performing about as bad as they did in Chechnya in 94-5. So the war was always about preserving the grip of the Putin regime on Russia. And now it turned into a fight of survival because of how they failed. And focusing on this internal politics is a motive for the attack, and for what is going on now is crucial, because I argue it kind of blindsided everyone to the Russian motives, behavior, and performance going into the invasion.
Thank you. So, of course, the situation of Ukrainian civilians is terrible. In cities like Mariupol, I think we've all seen the pictures in the media. What could be realistically done to improve the situation of these civilians in war zones?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. That's like the hardest, ethically and morally hardest and most difficult issue going on. And it's really very difficult to be optimistic on that front and find some light at the end of the tunnel, at least on the short term. You have to keep in mind that civilian casualties and suffering is not collateral damage in the Russian way of war under Putin. It's a deliberate strategy. So terrorizing the population with indiscriminate violence has been the main tactic that the Putin regime relied on to break resistance in Chechnya, also in Syria. So the brutal bombing of big cities in these campaigns, Grozny and Aleppo, were really not accidents or acts of negligence, but was a deliberate strategy of terrorizing populations into submission. So when you kind of see that background, it's easier to say probably what would make things worse than what would help in many ways with the civilian population. So one thing that will not help probably is that going for peace at all costs so that Putin stops the campaign. And this will not only not end the conflict, but will encourage further aggression on the Russian side, because he might want to compensate for this humiliation in many ways and then keep pressing forward. And keep in mind, even if he receives concession and he does accept a ceasefire, Putin still needs conflict to justify the repression at home and the sense of existential fear that sustains his power at home. So he will not negotiate in good faith, and he will break ceasefires when he needs this as well. So like this is not going to be the end of the conflict if concessions are given to him, like more extensive ones. The other extreme is like the direct Western intervention, which some people call for. But the problem with that is that it might corner the Putin regime even more and push the regime to resort to more extreme steps, including use of WMDs, weapons of mass destruction. And again, this will hurt the Ukrainian civilians as well. And the worst repercussions will be felt by them. So in summary, I guess the middle kind of position, as imperfect as it is, seems to be the best that could be done to help Ukrainian civilians and Ukraine in general, and that is to arm and support the Ukrainian military so that it can push back Russia and localize the fighting and deter Russia from further aggression. So unfortunately, not a very satisfying approach and an outcome, but still, it's hard to see how the more extreme ones would outperform it basically at this point.
Thank you. Well, you've previously mentioned that this war is as well about internal affairs in Russia, and you've recently published a book called Popular Dictatorships, Crisis, Mass Opinion, and the Rise of Electoral Authoritarianism. So what do you think? Can the Russian government control public opinion effectively, and how important is this to do so for its stability?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So coming out of that research I just completed in the book, popular consent is essential for sustaining Putinism, which is a bit paradoxical because this is an autocracy, but it was still sustained by the population. The reason for that is that without popular support, the regime would neither has the power to suppress major popular uprisings. It cannot control its population unless the population or a major chunk of the population supports the regime. And also it cannot control its elites. Keep in mind that Putinism is a system that relies on corruption and cronyism to control the elites, and on the popularity of its leader to control the population and shield the corrupt elite from popular rebellion. So take away from that equation the popular support or popular consent to Putinism, and the whole thing crumbles. Basically, you would have elite challenges against Putin, and you would have popular rebellion at the same time. You might ask here why people support a leader that is shielding a corrupt elite, and this can get worse as well after the disastrous performance in Ukraine, the sanctions, and so on. Well, the answer lies in the circumstances that gave rise to Putinism. So one of the core findings of the book is that Russians have supported Putin because they genuinely desire a strong man, not necessarily Putin himself, but a strong man who will save Russia from the catastrophic decline it experienced in the 1990s after the Soviet collapse. So the roots of Putinism lie in this trauma of the 1990s. Putinist propaganda works not because it brainwashes people, but because it plays on the fears of the generations that experienced this trauma of the 90s. For context, you have to keep in mind that Russia's cataclysms in the 1990s effectively were the biggest peacetime decline in history. This was on the socioeconomic side. The decline was twice as large and lasting twice as long as the Great Depression in Germany that produced the Nazi regime. So in terms of the trauma, this is massive. And many ordinary Russians coming out of that experience supported Putin's strong-arm style of government, not because it's their best choice, but because they thought it was the least bad choice, that their country will disintegrate if there is no kind of strongmen to keep it together. And this fear of foreign encroachment was part of that, which the regime is now trying to kind of mobilize again with the Ukraine invasion. So this fear of the repeat of the 1990s has been the primary force keeping Putin in power, even as the economic achievements of Putinism vanish. So it's like, in terms of mentality, it's like the better the devil you know, then the saint you don't know kind of logic for how people vote in Russia and how they support Putinism, especially for those who fear Russia will collapse without its strongman ruler. So what big high stakes wars like the one in Ukraine do in this context is to recreate the traumas that sustained the strongman rule and demobilize the opposition to the regime. They make the broader population reluctant to join the opposition, so they avoid undermining the authorities in time of war. People are afraid that they'll undermine the war effort, if you like, if they oppose the system. It also divides the opposition. It's hard to see how Russian nationalists and communists, on one hand, which are about 2/3 of the Russian kind of voting population, they would have a hard time now joining hands with liberals against Putin in a time of war. Also, it justifies harsh repression of the opposition as well. When you have war in the background, all this jailing of opposition leaders is easier to carry out. It scares away other the dissatisfied people, this repression. And it also forces out a lot of the younger, urban, educated, connected elites that are the backbone of Putin's opponents, and it forced them into exile. We saw like there's this huge exile going on in this past month of those kinds of people who are typically the opponents of the regime. I mean, the interesting thing about this is that we saw the same pattern during the Yugoslav wars. The Milosevic regime, if you like, in Serbia, which was the initiator of most of these wars, was ahead of the curve in the strongman playbook on Putin. It's kind of really, in many ways, a recreation of what happened there. Milosevic managed to stay in power for about 11 years and I think 14 elections or so, despite never having majority support. Because the wars allowed him to demobilize and divide the population, so he kind of presides over the whole system. So again, in terms of the ability to control the population, I'm not very optimistic in the way of change. We got to keep in mind other extreme examples. For instance, Iraq's dictator Saddam Hussein managed to stay in power despite a catastrophic loss in the first Gulf War in 91. After that, he stayed for more than a decade, and he was only dislodged by another foreign intervention. So such extreme scenarios are possible. Of course, it would be preferable if we didn't get to that point. But wars create backgrounds in which leaders that have very, very thin, support, if you like, manage to stay on for a long time.
Okay, so just some of your main argument that Russia is creating and sustaining this crisis in order to instrumentalize it for the purpose of creating public consent or for supporting the government.
Yeah, so this has been absolutely, Putinism, you have to remember, it rose to power through a stage managed conflict. So when Putin was appointed successor to Boris Yeltsin in August 1999, he was an unknown apparatchik with negative approval ratings. And 2 months later, the brutal prosecution of the Second Chechen War made him ultra popular, basically. He demonstrated he was the strongman messiah, if you like, who can save Russia from the decline and the trauma of the 1990s for a lot of people living through this. And he sustained this popularity by projecting the strongman image to a population that was assured by it for this whole time. His approval ratings kind of never dropped below 60% until at least 2011. And then again, exploded to even higher, like over 80% after the Crimea annexation. So playing this indispensable strongman provided Putin with approval ratings ranging between about 60 to 90%, which studies have shown have been largely genuine support. So this is a super majority support, and it has been a main pillar of the Putin regime. It granted domination across like the over Russian society, institution, and elites, because as long as he was popular, the system of organized corruption he presided over was shielded from mass rebellion. And that same popularity meant that nobody in the Russian elite, which was and it still is highly despised by the public, could challenge the system. The popularity allowed Putin to effectively police the elite. It ensured no regional leader, no security official, bureaucrat, oligarch, or the outnumbered liberal opposition could challenge Putin. So that was kind of the essence there. But over time, Putin's appeal began to exhaust itself because Russia's stabilization began to make Putin look redundant. Things were stable enough. We don't need a strongman anymore. And the corruption and the staleness of the regime began to alienate the more educated urban middle class. And this is what you might call the curse of the strongman regime, because they become redundant both when they fail in their mission of bringing stability and when they succeed in it. They kind of exhaust their mission, if you like. So Putin needed to recreate the crises and threats that kept the fear of the 1990s in Russia and justified his rules. And this is what led to the Crimea annexation and the first war, if you like, in Ukraine. And like in terms of their effects on Russian domestic politics, these conflicts temporarily kind of reversed the clock back to the early years of Putinism, to the Second Chechen War when he originally became popular, allowing Putin to first demonstrate competence, that he can defeat these foreign enemies and restore the mantle of Russia's indispensable protector. They demobilize opposition to Putin's rule because people are reluctant to resist the regime when the country is perceived to be facing external threats. And it made some people who lived through the 90s afraid of a future without Putin, afraid that their country will slip back to chaos again if Putin is removed. And in 22, Putin wanted to recreate the Crimea invasion and the Chechnya invasion, the Second Chechen War, if you like, but on a much larger scale. And now he miscalculated, and it's really about where this is going to go, given the disaster actually he imposed on himself.
Thank you. Since you have extensively published on the Balkans, and you have as well mentioned in this interview, what does the war in Ukraine mean for the Balkan region right now?
That's a great question, and thank you for asking that. I think the jury is still out on this one because how the war finishes will be the most important impacts, and we're still far from some finishing of this war. But the conduct of the war this far leaves some space for cautious optimism, honestly. And analysis that overestimated Russian power going into the invasion considered the Balkans could be turned into another front, Russian stimulating conflicts in places like Bosnia and Kosovo, for instance, to undermine the West from more on the inside, while the Ukrainian campaign is going on the outside. Well, now the disastrous performance of Russia in the military sphere in particular largely shattered such fears and deflated some of the forces in the Balkans that could have carried out such scenarios on behalf of Russia. And depending on how the war in Ukraine and its aftermath turns out, one important consequence is also going to be political, and that is the decline of the appeal of the Putinist mode of strongman rule, which some leaders in the region and also some voting constituencies have adopted. Putin was for, substantial numbers of populations in some countries and also some leaders was a kind of an example, if you like. So the fact now that Putin turned out not to be a 10-foot tall, very robust, brilliant leader who can kind of control the situation and lead your country better will gravely undermine the appeal of the assorted mini Putins across the Balkans, if you like, and Europe in general. So that's kind of the positive side, I would say. On the more troubling side, the economic ripple effects for the Balkans and Europe as a whole might be significant. Countries in the region, a lot of them are dependent on Russia for energy, Russia and Ukraine for food supplies, also export markets. The broader ripple effects of a potentially wider recession that might be triggered by the conflict are poised to hit hard the already economically weak Balkans, kind of reeling from the pandemic shock. So this can weaken governments, lead to street protests, instability. But when you kind of step back and compare these two, the positive, if you like, so far, and the negative, from a global order perspective, this is less threatening than the alternative scenario of Russia seeking to unravel the Balkan order set up after the Yugoslav crisis, after the end of like the Dayton peace agreement, the Kosovo resolution. So the potential chaos would be more likely disorganized rather than organized, which is a less bad outcome, if you like. So in some ways, right now, things in the Balkans look a little better than they might if Russia was really successful and conducted a blitzkrieg in Ukraine.
Thank you very much for sharing your insights and point of view. Is there any additional point you would like to make in the context of the current situation in Ukraine?
Sure. Like, there's a lot of things we can talk about. It's really I think the next two or 3 weeks will be decisive in seeing some light at the end of the tunnel in terms of the resolution of the conflict, I would say, because Russia kind of exhausted itself with this effort. They're trying to reconfigure their goals. They're trying to sell this domestically in many ways. So this uncertainty, as to where things are going, and most importantly, the suffering that is going on in Ukraine, hopefully will turn a corner on that one. And the next few weeks will be essential to see what that new order will be after that. So people should, I'm pretty sure everybody's staying tuned on this topic, but not tire really of putting pressure on Russia at this point, and supporting Ukraine to achieve those objectives. These will be crucial, few weeks up to a month, I would say, for the resolution of the conflict. Hopefully, as you said, especially for the Ukrainian civilians, this will come to a quick resolution at this stage.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you.